Conas T, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales podcast, where we tell Irish myths set to original music. My name is Sorcha and I'm one half of the sibling storytelling duo who founded this company. In this episode we continue our series on the Fianna, also known as the Fianna Saga, with Cailte's tales. He was the fastest man in the Fianna and he had many tales to tell. This one is told by my brother Aron. If you'd like to listen to our reflections, our chats, support the podcast and connect with us directly, you can join our Candlelit crew by following the links in the description below. But for now, Aron, tell us a story.
The Thin Grey Man. Cailte McRonan, the fastest one of the Fianna. Loyal to Cool and to his son, Fionn McCool, after he reclaimed the leadership of the Fianna. Cailte was one of the first to find young Fionn, giving him advice and wondering whether he was up to the job. But Cailte was not always present for many of the adventures. He was so fast, it was said that he could run in between worlds. And so, some of his adventures, as he would tell in the great halls of the king in winter time when they were gathered together, was to share the beauty and the bounty of the other world. He would describe the ornamentation of the castles there, the taste of the food, the exquisite animals and mysterious creatures that he had seen. Everyone was transfixed when Cailte spoke. Not all his stories were above the other world, though. He often trained with the rest of the Fenians. On the Curragh, in the plains, he would attempt to teach others to be as fast as him. No one could be, though. Still, he would watch as some stumbled through the tests of the Fianna and attempted to gain their place in the legendary ranks. He was always curious when he saw nobles come, well trained and well versed in sword fighting and spear throwing, accustomed to hunting and far too accustomed to comfort. Accustomed to the luxuries of living in castles and towns and halls. These were no wild men, no wild women. These ones that came with noble riches and noble births, well, they had great ideas of maybe coming into the Fianna for a while and returning to claim their father's lands. But Cailte was aware of how the Fians of old used to be something of a sort of holiday for these nobles. Something of a sort of an excursion for a while to get their wildness out of them so they could sit down and be loyal to their kings and great, well, somewhat good kings and leaders for their people. But he always wondered at those that came to prove something. To who, he'd wonder. And even after many adventures in the summer months, he would always have a choice of what stories to tell. And on this particular night, when he was in the hall of a king in Munster, he chose to tell a fairly ordinary story. He had many stories after all, and there had been some funny stories to begin with during the night, and there was many heroes there laughing and enjoying the tales spewing out of the mouths of. And he did love hearing how Conan had been given the sheep's back put onto his back after he had been ripped off an enchanted sofa, losing the skin of his back, and only for Fionn's magic thumb were they able to secure the skin of a sheep onto his back. Forevermore, meaning that he had to be shorn every year, the big black tufts of wool poking out from behind whatever clothes he would wear. And every time the story told, women and girls, boys and men would laugh and cackle and look and see if they could find a tuft of wool sticking out from under his cloak. But it was time to tell somewhat of a more serious tale. Fado, he began. A long time ago, there was a king named Furduk the Prosperous, and he had 2 sons. Now, suddenly the whole hall was looking at Cailte. They were all envisaging where this story might go. Had he fought and battled great cat heads or dog heads? Was this the one where they get lost in the other world, only for Cailte to run back in between and find their way again? You see, Furduk, the Prosperous, had owned all of Ireland once, every inch, every breath, from the north, the south, the east and west. Every tree, every shrub, every crop and every cow. But when Furduk died, he had 2 sons, and they decided to split the island in 2. But not between the north and south, and not between the east and west. No. They split it in a different kind, and a kind I'm going to tell to you now. This is what they did. For one brother, Tual was his name, was given all the wild places, the cliffs and the beaches, the hills and the forests, the wild game and the birds in the trees, the foam on the waves and the leaves falling off trees, the loneliest places, the wildness of Ireland was given to Tual. But to the other son, Fianna, Fianna got the lodgings, the cattle, the livestock, every single pig and swine and chicken, the goods, the castles, the halls, the mead, and of course the wine. All of the goods, all of the things, all of the commodities. And this was how they split it, between them, you see. So I'd ask yourself now, which do you think got the better deal? Cailte smiled and began to sit down, enjoying the outrageous remarks he could overhear. People began to shout and lambast Cailte. Sure, that's ridiculous. There's no way there's a contest. Sure, aren't we in a castle? No, sure, Fianna surely got the better deal there. And the murmurings went on, the talking and the arguing amongst the people there, and the Fianna who, well, they all knew the answer. Cailte stood and hushed the rest of the crowd and said, "Yeah, you might think that the second son got the better deal, all right. But for all of you out there looking at the wild places as something that you wouldn't want to go near, let it be known that for every one of the Fenians here gathered, 'tis the first son, Tual, who got the better deal. And we see the richness in the wild, far-off places, far more than anything you might call a commodity, for we have none of that." "Aron, go on, tell us another one." Cailte smiled. "It was not so long ago that the king asked for all of the fastest people to be gathered in Tara, and so I went up along with the rest to try and prove myself." "Oh, I've heard this one before. Do you know this one?" "Oh, I do indeed, yeah." Cailte hushed the murmuring and went on with the story, explaining how it was that the king in Candlelit had asked the greatest and fastest to gather in Tara, how he had gone from one man to the next contender, and there were women there too, of course, seeking to prove themselves amongst these hardened racers. And he asked them all how long it would take for each one of them to gather a grain of sand from every beach in Ireland. Now, most of them had to think fairly long about how many beaches there were in Ireland before they could put a rough estimate together. Some had to think about time and delivery and when they might sleep happened, how he might get from the beaches in the east to the south, the rugged coastline in the west, and how they'd traverse the long peninsulas and come back in and around every beach. There was a lot of beaches. There's a lot of pondering, there's a lot of thinking. And as the king went up the line, the sun had begun to dip. It had been bright and early when they all gathered. But Cailte had heard the question early on, and he'd set off. By the time he got back, he was covered in sweat. But he had moved so fast. He was carrying on his shoulder a heavy bag at this stage. And when the king came to the last man before Cailte, he asked him how long it would take for him to gather a grain of sand from every beach in Ireland. The man came up with 3.5 months, he said. Maybe 3.5 weeks, looking at Cailte, who was laughing. Then the king turned to the laughing man and said, "Well, how much time would it take you?" And I just threw the bag down, off my back, spilling sand out in front of the king. And I said, "While you were talking." The whole hall erupted in a cheer. Many had heard the tale before, the grains of sand, but to hear it from Cailte's lips that night had been a treat indeed. But soon it was time for a sad tale. And they'd all looked at Cailte again and asked him to tell them one last story. Gull had been going off about some battle against the Loughlin's sons. But no, they wanted to hear Cailte's last story. And seeing as they had asked him so kindly, Cailte said, "All right, I'll tell you another story there, so. But this one weighs heavy on my heart. 'Tis a sad tale, and I'm not proud of it, not proud at all." And so he began to tell them the story of when he travelled up the Croagh to the Cave of Cats, Aon the Gat. As he mentioned the name Aon the Gat, a hush and a silence grew. You could hear a pin drop in the whole hall. Aon the Gat, Aon the Gat. Aon the Gat, the Cave of Cats, the portal to the other world. This, the home of the Morrigan, the Marignu, the shapeshifter who would come through that portal. But she was not the only one who could come through there. Many legends told of Queen Maeve offering something to the other world to lure out great devilish demons, serpents and cats to test the hero Cuchulainn, or when she needed to face the otherworldly powers. Many knew of the otherworldly powers that were in Aon the Gat, and most were afraid and too afraid to ever go into it for fear of falling into and never returning from the other world itself. But there was one time I was called to help rid the place of a plague, for the farmers up there were losing sheep left and right, and it was all on account of the night of Samhain, when the veil was pure thin and you could step between the worlds. And the two a day often came across in creatures and forms of otherworldly power. Well, the Fola had been coming, the wolves. As he said this, heads turned, the whisperings increased. The Fola, the werewolves, were they real, you think? Those creatures who could transform between human and wolf. Wolves were terrifying creatures who could snatch a baby away. And to have the likeness and mind of a human, or even worse, a fae, was fierce and formidable indeed. he raised his hand and hush came on to them again. Aye, there were Fola there, all right. There were the wolves, the Mactir, the son of the land, and we should all respect these brilliant creatures. And I'm sorry to say, I had my hand to play in killing 3. For it was the farmers that awed me, the farmers who begged me help them. And it was Cus Corach, the harper, whose help I would not have been able to do without. And this was how it happened. And so he told them how Cus Corach, the harp player, had told him that these wolves were coming out the days coming up to Samhain, and they had been doing it for many years, and each year the daughters of Airtok were coming out in the shape of wolves to hunt and to harry, to devour and demolish the herds all around Croagh. They slipped between the veil, hunted at will and destroyed whatever they wanted, and ran back into Ounagat and jumped into the portal and beyond through to the other world. This was all well fun for them, no doubt. Airtok, a mysterious character. One of the Tuatha had 3 beautiful daughters. They say one was fair-haired, one dark and one red-haired. All beautiful, all deadly, all able to transform to the shape and speed and deadliness of the wolf. And so when Cailte arrived and talked to Cus Corach, this brilliant harp player, he told Cailte that he had played his harp and managed to subdue these wolves once. They had listened to him playing, and he hadn't been eaten. So Cailte had told him to go to the mouth of Ounagat, to play on his harp, and he would lie in waiting and watch to see if what he said was true. Well, on the night before Samhain, he watched Cus Corach sit down at the mouth of Ounagat, produce his harp, begin to play beautiful music up and down, the melody floating all around the land. And 1 and 2 and 3 wolves appeared. They sniffed and circled and sat down listening to the beautiful harp music until Cus Corach had finished. The 3 wolves, their ears spiked, their noses flared, and they darted off and ran off into the hills, no doubt devouring some poor farmer's herds. Cailte had a heavy heart as he told Cus Corach what he needed to do. For these people needed to be protected, and they were asking Cailte, one of the Fianna, to serve and protect them. This was what the Fianna were all about, after all. And so I told Cus Corach to go once more and play, but this time to talk to them and ask them to turn back into their human form. And this is what happened. But I tell you now, 'twas with a heavy heart that I did this last step. 'Twas only for the asking that I did it. 'Twas only for the wailing of the babes, and to leave them without any sustenance for the winter, that I thought it was the right thing to do. But I still wonder, did I do the right thing at all? So Cus Corach went to Ounagat and played on the harp, and the music drew out those 3 wolves, the daughters of Airtok, and they, with their sparkling eyes, pointed ears and whipping tails, beautiful wolves, the Macanti. They circled to get nearer to Cus Corach, and as they sat and listened to the beautiful melody of the music he played, Cus Corach uttered the words that Cailte had told him to tell them. "Maybe you'd like to listen to the music in your human form, for after all, this is a harp made by a man, and 'tis for humans' ears to listen to. I think you'd enjoy it more if you turned yourselves back into, your own bodies." The wolves nearly snarled, but the three of them sniffed, looked, and then, thinking they were perfectly safe, they transformed, their snouts coming back into their face, their ears shrinking, their arms growing longer, tails shortening and disappearing, their legs widening, elongating, their fur shrinking and turning back into soft, pale skin. They pulled robes, materialised out of thin air around their naked bodies, pale, beautiful, one dark, one blonde, one red, each one more beautiful than the last. They smiled, thinking them all alone with no threat at all. But Cailte had been downwind of them. Cailte had known they'd smell him if he was upwind. They'd smell his intention. They'd smell his weapon. As Coscorak played the melody building into a brilliant finale, the three of them swooned, one leaning their head on the other and the last lying closer to the feet of Coscorak, the three women, hip to hip and shoulder to shoulder. They never saw me. They never even knew. But there and then, I jumped out of the bush and drove my spear straight through the three of them in one go, sticking them as if on a spit. The three most beautiful women I'd ever seen died by my hand and my hand alone. And not a day goes by that I don't think of the daughters of Airtuk, the wildness of their prowling, their hunting, their speed and their beauty. And not a day goes by that I wish we could live side by side with the wildness and the savagery of Mactir, the wolves of the land. But no, all of you here with your desires for things and goods and all that you hold dear is under threat when the wildness is near. So let you all take a walk into the bright, fresh night. Have a think of what you hold dearest, and have a think of the Macantir, the Fola, and send a prayer to the daughters of Airtuk. As Cailte sat down in the hall of the King of Munster, every one felt saddened by his tale. Fast and brilliant he was, hardened by war, hardened by duty, and at what cost did he pay to kill the daughters of Airtuk? Many more stories would be told, many more questions would be asked, but always Cailte MacRonan, the thin grey man of the Fianna, the fastest of all of the heroes of Ireland and the Fenians alike, would always hold a certain sadness for the lack of the magic of the wolves in this land.